This is the Chinese god Yu Huang, usually translated as the Jade Sovereign, though he goes by other titles: the Highest Emperor, the Most Exalted in Mysterious Eminence, or more simply, the Jade Emperor. And yes, that's a banknote for 500 million Chinese yuan, currently worth around 69 million US dollars. But before you start planning a shopping spree, just know that you'd kind of need to be dead to use it. This is hell money, a ceremonial currency burned as an offering to ancestors in Chinese popular religion. The Jade Emperor often appears on hell money, and he's one of the most popular gods in Chinese religion. He rules heaven, he's the sovereign of all the gods, and like an earthly emperor, he's usually shown in full imperial regalia, with robes, a beaded crown, and seated on a throne. But in many stories, he didn't start that way. He began as a human prince who gave up his throne and spent countless lifetimes cultivating the Tao. So who is the Jade Emperor, and how did he climb the cosmic career ladder from a humble immortal in training to the top job in the divine bureaucracy? First, know that the Jade Emperor is conceptualized a bit differently in Chinese popular religion versus Daoism. Now, Chinese popular religion refers to the religious beliefs and practices common to Chinese culture, regardless of any person's affiliation or lack thereof with the big three religious and philosophical traditions of China: Buddhism, Confucianism, and Daoism. We should also remember that when we're talking about Chinese culture, we're not just talking about people in mainland China or Taiwan, but also overseas Chinese communities in places like Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, and so on. For example, a lot of the clips I've shown so far are actually from the Jade Emperor Pagoda in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. Popular religion is sometimes called folk religion and is a common category you might see on major demographic surveys like those conducted by Pew Research Center. But scholars prefer to use the term popular because the word folk might imply lower classes or the non-elite, but elements of popular religion are common among all levels of Chinese society. So how is the Jade Emperor conceptualized in Chinese popular religion? Well, he's the emperor, the lord of heaven and the divine bureaucracy, the sovereign of all the gods. And like an earthly emperor, he commands all below him, handing out punishments and rewards and keeping the lower gods in check. But even though he's at the top of the divine hierarchy, the Jade Emperor is not beyond the reach of mere mortals. He's also known by the more intimate name, Heavenly Grandfather, and people who need urgent and powerful intervention can appeal to him directly, especially if their petitions to lower gods have gone unanswered. The Jade Emperor is particularly associated with New Year celebrations in China. The 9th day of the first lunar month is specifically dedicated to him, sometimes called his birthday. On this day, special prayers and offerings are made at his temples and shrines, and you'll see some pretty lavish offerings. In Fujian province, for example, devotees bring dozens upon dozens of entire roasted pigs to his temples, placing them on benches with bright oranges tucked into their mouths. And perhaps not coincidentally, his birthday falls just 3 days before the Jade Emperor receives the kitchen or stove god of every household. The stove god Zhaoshen, also called the King of the Stove, is a popular household god in China. He's believed to keep an eye on everyone's behavior throughout the year and report their good or bad deeds to the Jade Emperor every year. So it makes sense to pay your respects to the Jade Emperor a few days before the stove god gives his report. So what about Daoism? Well, in Daoism, the Jade Emperor is a very important god, but he's slightly less important than how he's viewed in popular religion, ranking right below the most supreme gods of Daoism, the three clarities or the three pure ones. Each embodies a different aspect of the Tao. You can watch my intro to Daoism to learn what that really means, but briefly you can think of the Tao as ultimate reality and its manifestations in everyday life. Another definition is the underlying cosmic power which created the universe. And if you've studied Daoism even a little bit, you probably already know one of the three pure ones: the Lord of the Way and its virtue, the heavenly manifestation of Lao Tzu, the quasi-historical philosopher said to have composed the Tao Te Ching. The standard view in Daoism these days is that the Jade Emperor is chief among the four sovereigns, four deities ranking right below the three pure ones. He's invoked as part of every major liturgy, which means that almost any time a ritual is performed by a Daoist priest, the Jade Emperor is invited to descend and witness the ceremony. He also has shrines in virtually every temple, so he still is a big deal in Daoist theology, even if he's not the top god. Multiple scriptures in the Daoist canon detail different methods for worshipping the Jade Emperor, should it ever be necessary to petition him directly. The Daoist canon is a collection of roughly 1,500 texts that include a mix of sacred histories, revealed scriptures and prophecies, instructions for worship, and manuals for making talismans and more. The main scripture dedicated to the Jade Emperor is the collected scripture on the deeds of the Jade Sovereign, which is preserved in the Daoist canon alongside a commentary and a summary dated to 1344 CE. The Daoist scholar and priest Christopher Schipper even considers this text one of the most sacred scriptures of modern Daoism. The text says that the Jade Emperor was born a royal prince, but he was no ordinary baby. At the moment of his birth, his precious body was radiant with light, which filled the entire kingdom. He grew up, and after his father died, the future Jade Emperor then renounced his throne and dedicated his life to studying the Tao. Well, he didn't just dedicate his one life, he dedicated countless lifetimes. The text says his rise took billions of years. In one stretch, he lived through 800 kalpas or world cycles prescribing medicines and curing illnesses, healing the world and leading beings toward peace. In another, he spent 800 more world cycles compiling Daoist scriptures and revealing the numinous stanzas, spreading wisdom and aiding the living and the dead. Only after enduring 3,200 eras of relentless practice did he reach a new level, earning the title Tathagata, a deeply loaded Buddhist term often used for the Buddha himself and other cosmic Buddhas in Mahayana Buddhism. So this is a very big deal. The text marks the Jade Sovereign as a fully enlightened cosmic teacher on par with the Buddha. The scholar Bonnie Shackner argues that this is a pointed assertion that Daoism is superior to Buddhism. While it only took 3,200 kalpas for the Jade Emperor to achieve Buddhahood, he then spent millions more beyond that to attain Jade Emperorhood. And sure enough, the text goes on to say that the Jade Sovereign out-Buddhas the Buddha, teaching bodhisattvas the true path to awakening. It says he taught the bodhisattvas the authentic tradition of the Great Vehicle that leads to sudden awakening and how to gradually enter the wondrous Tao of emptiness. In this process of cultivation, he experienced again a billion world cycles and commenced to achieve the condition of Jade Thearch. That term Great Vehicle is a Buddhist term, Mahayana in Sanskrit. It's used to describe the expansive path of enlightenment that leads to the salvation of all beings. But here, that same Mahayana language is co-opted to describe the Daoist path. And that term emptiness is another key Buddhist idea, often called shunyata, which describes the insight that all things lack a fixed, permanent essence. But here, the Jade Sovereign is said to guide bodhisattvas into the wondrous Tao of emptiness, a distinctly Daoist reinterpretation. So this scripture recasts awakening in Daoist terms, by aligning oneself with the Tao. Now, outside of Daoism and Chinese popular religion, the Jade Sovereign is also believed to be a human who attained immortality and transcended the world. Stories about this appear in pop culture as early as the Ming Dynasty, such as the Chinese novel The Investiture of the Gods, which went on to be a major influence on later novels and dramas. We don't know who actually wrote it, but it clearly draws on older legends and traditions that have been floating around for a while. The story itself is epic. It's set during the time when the Zhou Dynasty overthrew the corrupt Shang Dynasty with a lot of help from divine forces. The title refers to what happens at the end. All of the heroes and villains get assigned their proper places in the celestial hierarchy. The Jade Emperor is depicted as a shrewd official in the court of the first Zhou ruler, and when the gods start handing out heavenly appointments, he seizes his moment, basically exploiting a pun that sounds a lot like his name and uses it to claim the title of Jade Emperor. Though the Daoist perspective is more elevated than this, the collected scripture on the deeds of the Jade Sovereign paint the god as a cosmic sage, a god whose authority is rooted in unimaginable self-cultivation and spiritual sacrifice. He's not simply granted the throne of heaven because he's born a prince, nor does he seize it as an opportunistic official. He earns it through billions of years of devotion, healing, scripture writing, and even martyrdom. We also get hints of medieval arguments between Daoism and Buddhism. By fusing Buddhist language with Daoist metaphysics, the text asserts Daoism's supremacy, and in so doing, the text reimagines the Jade Sovereign not as a rival to the Buddha, but as a being who teaches the Buddhas what they didn't quite get right. What's interesting is that this is the earliest text devoted only to the Jade Sovereign, but it's a relatively late text historically speaking. Chinese religious history spans thousands and thousands of years, but this text dates to the early medieval period, in the 10th or 11th century CE. So even though the Jade Emperor is really important in Chinese religion today, that really didn't happen until the medieval period. So how did he come to be the top god? Now, we see glimmers of an idea of a top heavenly god as far back as the Shang Dynasty during the 2nd millennium BCE, with the high god called Shangdi, often translated as Lord Above. Later, the Zhou Dynasty preferred to speak of Tian, or heaven, as the source of moral authority. So the idea that the cosmos had a supreme ruler does go way back in Chinese history, though it's a stretch to draw a straight line from Shangdi or Tian all the way through to the Jade Sovereign described in Daoist scriptures. Though later Daoists did adopt the title Shangdi for the Jade Emperor, the god we find in later theology is a fully personified, morally perfected being with a backstory and a heavenly bureaucratic role. For that more personified figure, we need to jump forward to the Han Dynasty. In Chinese religion at this time, it seems that the highest god was the Queen Mother of the West. She was sometimes paired with a King Father of the East, but we don't hear about him very often. Shortly after the Han Dynasty, the Queen Mother starts appearing alongside the Azure Lad. Now, this name is a bit of a misnomer. Lad refers to him having obtained eternal youth rather than being a young boy, and he was a very powerful god, kind of like a celestial chief of staff. He's usually called by fancier titles like Supreme Minister, basically the heavenly equivalent of a top-ranking cabinet official. And his job is overseeing the cosmic bureaucracy that manages the fates of earthly transcendence, people trying to become immortal. Some early medieval texts refer to him as Yu Huang, the Jade Sovereign, but the Azure Lad is not the same as the Jade Emperor, at least not yet. Titles like Yu Huang and even more elaborate forms like Exalted and Superior Yu Huang do appear in Daoist texts, but they don't quite refer to a single, clearly defined deity yet. Yu Huang could be used to refer to a divine office, a class of celestial being, or different deities altogether. In some texts, for example, there were multiple Jade Sovereigns presiding over different stars or heavenly realms. Other texts indicate that Jade Sovereign was a bureaucratic office that could be occupied by different gods, instead of a single divine personality. But fast forward a couple of hundred years to the Tang Dynasty, and Yu Huang became the common term for a god who ruled the heavens, and the Jade Emperor began to emerge more prominently as a distinct deity, replacing the Azure Lad in his position as the male counterpart to the Queen Mother of the West. But it's not until the 11th century under the Song Dynasty that the Jade Emperor finally ascended to the top tier of the Chinese pantheon, and it's all thanks to imperial intervention. During the reign of Emperor Zhenzong, the Jade Emperor received grand new titles: Most High, Grand Heavenly Thearch, Jade Sovereign who comprehends the Tao, regulates the calendar, holds the talisman, and unfolds the heaven. Good luck fitting that on a business card. He was enshrined at major state altars and formally incorporated into the register of state sacrifices. Now, this register was maintained by the imperial court, and it effectively determined which gods were legitimate and eligible for state-sponsored worship. And using this register, it was the local magistrate's job to determine whether a deity was divine, deviant, or demonic, and temples to unregistered gods could be labeled illicit cults and demolished by local authorities. But even with all of this official recognition, things were not exactly theologically tidy. Historical records like the Songshi, that's the official history of the Song Dynasty, make it clear that the Jade Emperor was not the only top god in town. There were other top gods, like the Yellow Thearch and the Vast Heaven God, and people didn't just collapse them all into one figure. In fact, Emperor Zhenzong and his son Huizong tried to merge these gods by giving them those long, fancy combined titles. But that didn't really settle things theologically. In practice, each of these deities still had their own statues, their own rituals, and their own followers. So even though the Jade Emperor was rising in popularity, his role as the one supreme ruler of the heaven was still up for debate. Now, state patronage was not the only reason behind the Jade Emperor's rise. Popular religious practices also played a major role, especially practices centered around spirit writing and revelation through spirit mediums. Spirit writing in particular was a practice in which a god was believed to communicate by miraculously inscribing messages via a suspended brush or stylus. And during the Song Dynasty, the Jade Sovereign appears in Daoist texts as a supreme god who issues commands through divine messengers, using dreams, spirit writing, and possession. Even Emperor Zhenzong himself claimed to receive divine dreams from the Jade Sovereign, affirming his heavenly mandate. Now, this is a story that's obviously politically self-serving, but it also reflects the broader Song-era fascination with spirit possession and revelation. And that's just the official stuff. Outside the big three traditions of Confucianism, Daoism, and Buddhism, there were all kinds of local and personal versions of the Jade Emperor, a god you can petition in times of need, or a god who can visit you in your dreams. In fact, scholars have speculated that he was incorporated into the Daoist pantheon precisely because he was a popular god, and including him in Daoist worship would bring in more followers. Though of course, he's still below the three clarities. You need to save the topmost tier for exclusively Daoist deities after all. So the Jade Emperor's rise to a top god was negotiated both from above, through state-sponsored ritual, and from below, through the ecstatic experiences and grassroots rituals of popular religion. So let's circle back now to Buddhism. Remember in the collected scripture on the deeds of the Jade Sovereign, the main Daoist text about the Jade Emperor, the text has a not-so-subtle critique of Buddhism, saying that the Jade Emperor is way better than the Buddha, both in power and wisdom. Well, Buddhist philosophers didn't just stand by while the Jade Emperor climbed the cosmic career ladder. Once the deity became a nationwide figure, backed by the Song state, Buddhists needed to figure out what to do with him. They couldn't just ignore the Jade Emperor's popularity, but they weren't exactly thrilled about it either. So they took a two-pronged approach. polemic, and appropriation. On the one hand, Buddhist texts from the Song period openly criticized Daoist claims about the Jade Emperor's supremacy. In one anecdote, a Buddhist monk shuts down two Daoist priests who had claimed that the Jade Emperor outranked the Buddha. The text says there were two Daoist priests discussing with a Buddhist monk how the grand thearch Jade Sovereign was greater than the Buddha. The Buddhist monk became confused. The master said to the Daoist priests, "Why does Buddha appear seated at the temple while Chakra and the Jade Sovereign appear standing at his side?" As in, the monk reminds them that in Buddhist temples, the Jade Emperor is depicted standing beside the Buddha, not seated like the Enlightened One himself. In other words, know your place. On the other hand, Buddhists also absorbed the Jade Sovereign into their own cosmology by identifying him with Chakra, or Indra, a well-established Buddhist deity who rules over the Triastrimsha heaven on the summit of Mount Meru, the cosmological center of the Buddhist universe. Rather than fighting the god's popularity, they reframed him as just one more celestial being in the Buddhist cosmos. So while Buddhists objected to the idea that the Jade Emperor could rival the Buddha, they were also pragmatic. If you can't beat a god, reinterpret him. Alright, now I want you to think about the job title Jade Emperor for a second, or more pointedly, the Azure Lad's title, the Supreme Minister. These might sound like poetic names, but they actually tell us something important about how Chinese religion worked. Gods in many ways functioned like government officials in a divine bureaucracy. As I mentioned, in Chinese popular religion, the Jade Emperor sits on the top of this divine bureaucracy, and below him are gods who have power within a well-defined sphere of influence, like how a magistrate only had authority in one town. For example, each town had a city god, who was kind of like a spiritual mayor. And also, as I mentioned earlier, each household had a kitchen god, believed to file reports on the family's behavior to the Jade Emperor. And just like how a human official could get promoted for doing a good job, the same avenue for promotion was open to gods. The better a deity performed, the more responsibility they might be given. A local spirit might start out with a pretty small area of influence, but over time, especially if people believed they were effective or benevolent, they could get promoted to a higher rank and have authority over a much wider area. So the divine world mirrored the earthly world. Gods had careers too, and they were promoted or demoted based on their effectiveness, popularity, and the rituals performed in their honor. So it was a big deal when the Song emperors promoted the Jade Emperor, got him on the official register, and gave him a ridiculously long title. This all reflected the popularity of the god and also how efficacious he was believed to be. Now, this might sound a bit strange if you're used to religions where gods are eternal, unchanging beings with a fixed place in some cosmic hierarchy. But in Chinese religion, the divine order is a lot more flexible. Not only can gods get promoted and move up the ranks, but regular humans can actually become gods over time. One way this can happen is when a local hero dies and develops a cult following after death. If the deceased hero continues to deliver benefits to the community, they may be rewarded not just with increased followers, but also an official rank and title. Some of the most popular gods in Chinese communities today, like Guan Yu and Matsu, followed this path. And as we saw with the collected scripture on the deeds of the Jade Sovereign, the Jade Emperor was believed to have been born a human and received his position and power after billions of years of cultivation. And when this kalpa or world cycle ends, he'll hand this position over to a different god and assume a new position. He also shows up all the time in Chinese pop culture. One great example is Journey to the West, probably the most famous Chinese story out there. It's a fictionalized version of a real historical journey, the Tang Dynasty monk Xuanzang's trip to India to collect Buddhist sutras. Since it was first composed in the late Ming Dynasty, people have not stopped adapting it. There are sequels, stage plays, cartoons, and movies. In the story, our heroic monk is aided by 3 supernatural companions: Pig, Sandy, and the Monkey King. But it's the Jade Emperor who sets the story in motion by banishing the Monkey King to Earth after the monkey eats the peaches of immortality, wrecks the Jade Emperor's banquet, and generally causes chaos in the heavens. Later, it's revealed that it was also the Jade Emperor who banished the other companions as well. These stories tell us a lot about how people imagine the Jade Emperor. He's not like the Christian god, some all-powerful, all-knowing being. The Jade Emperor feels more like, well, an emperor. He's powerful, yes, but he's also emotional, fallible, and maybe even a little gullible. You can trick him, but you better not push your luck, because just as easily as he hands out rewards, he can turn you into a pig or a river demon in the blink of an eye. And while you may or may not be worried about the kitchen god reporting your deeds to a heavenly emperor, you should be concerned about your data being bought and sold by shadowy internet middlemen. That's why I use today's sponsor, Incogni, which protects you from data brokers, private companies that collect your personal information from public records, websites, and even breach databases. Then they turn around and sell that information to advertisers, scam callers, or basically anyone with a checkbook. Incogni acts on your behalf. They reach out to these data brokers and request that your information be taken down. And if a broker resists, well, Incogni doesn't just give up. They follow up until the job is done, and they keep checking in over time to make sure your data stays off the market. They also recently rolled out a feature called custom removals, which is part of their unlimited plan. If you find your information on a sketchy website or a people search site, you can send Incogni the link and their privacy experts will work to get it down. And there's no cap, you can submit as many links as you need. I've been using Incogni for a few years now, and they've already removed my personal information from hundreds of sites. Some of those sites had what Incogni calls high sensitivity scores, meaning that they included more than just a name, they included things like my home address and employment history. If you want to try it out, just click the link in the description below and use the code RFB Incogni to get 60% off an annual plan. You'll also get 30 days risk-free to decide if it's right for you. Again, to take back control of your data, click the link below and use the code RFB Incogni.